welcome to the Reformand Initiative podcast, where we analyze and discuss Roman Catholic theology and practice from an evangelical perspective. My name is Clay Kennard. I'm your co-host, and I'm joined here by your other co-hosts and my brothers, Reed Carr and Leonardo De Chirico. We're sitting here in the city center of Rome. It's a rainy day, but we are pleased to be here to bring yet another one of our podcasts. This is going to be episode 9, but before we mention the title of our podcast, we want to mention our sponsor. We are proudly sponsored by Union School of Theology out of the UK. And this is an institution that forms men and women to grow Christ Church. It's an institution that offers various degrees from bachelor level all the way to a PhD. And they are preparing and equipping men and women to advance the gospel and build and edify God's church. So shout out to our wonderful sponsors at Union School of Theology. To find out more, visit their website at ust.ac.uk. That is ust.ac.uk. All right, Reed, so episode 9. This episode is titled, Why Vatican II is Essential to Understanding Present-Day Roman Catholicism. So, obviously, we're going to talk about Vatican II today. You want to explain some more to our listeners?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Clay mentioned today that it's rainy in Rome, but in fact, it's so rainy that the mayor yesterday canceled school. So all of our kids are sitting at home, and we braved the rain to get here. But
pray for our wives.
Yeah, it doesn't happen too often that the schools get closed due to rain, and what they're anticipating is some high winds. We'll see. It was definitely raining this morning, and I'm not sure it warranted a school closure yet, but we'll see. But yeah, so today we want to discuss a topic that we've been promising to discuss for a while now, but just haven't gotten around to doing it yet. Well, we're finally going to do that today, and this particular episode will be a bit different than our previous 8, in the sense that while our prior episodes have been almost exclusively theological in nature, today's will be almost exclusively informative in nature. But despite that difference, I think our listeners will find it interesting, and certainly we hope that they will find it to actually be informative. Well, the topic we want to discuss today is the latest council of the Roman Catholic Church, and that being Vatican II, which took place from 1962 to 1965. And as the title of this episode makes clear, the reason we are discussing Vatican II is that it is simply not possible to understand present-day Roman Catholic theology apart from Vatican II. It's simply not possible. So that's why we've been promising to discuss it and are finally doing so today. But before we get into the specifics of Vatican II, we need to set the table, so to say, for our discussion so that our listeners can fully appreciate Vatican II and why it is so important. So let's do 2 things. First, let's define what a church council is, according to the Roman Catholics' understanding of the term. And let's also explain why councils are so important in Roman Catholicism. So that's actually the first thing that has 2 little parts. But the second, we'll provide a brief historical review of the previous church councils leading up to Vatican II, just because without some sort of historical context, our discussion on Vatican II, I think, will be greatly weakened. But let's first define what a church council is. Leah, what exactly, in simple terms and in short response, what exactly is a church council, and why are they so important to the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, yes, a church council is a gathering of church leaders in the sense, in terms of the Catholic Church, bishops and cardinals convened by the reigning pope to discuss issues of common concern and to address problems and threats that the church faces. And so that this has been a tradition going on since the early centuries of the church, and so the latest council occurred 60 years ago or 50 years ago, and it's very tightly regulated by canon law. So there's often been a tension between who has the highest authority between the Pope and the Council, and that has been an ongoing point of discussion in Catholic theology.
And why would it be so? Why are they so important for the church?
Because the councils traditionally have produced documents, doctrinal documents, and decisions that have shaped the life of the church. So from dealing with doctrinal issues and controversies, to addressing heresies, to facing pastoral or church general problems, and oftentimes issuing curses and anathemas and punishments for dissenters and disobedient groups or people.
Okay. And let me make one quick distinction. Today, we hear about church councils, of course, but we also hear about church synods. For example, and we mentioned this because very recently there was an important church synod on the Amazon, if you follow Catholic news at all. But this synod addressed difficult challenges and issues that the Catholic Church is facing in that part of the world. But post-Vatican II, so after Vatican II, a synod is not to be confused with a church council. Prior to Vatican II, the terms were virtually interchangeable and synonymous. But post-Vatican II, they are no longer synonymous. In fact, the Catholic Church historian Norman Tanner explains why this is the case in his book, The Councils of the Church, A Short History. And he says, and I quote, "Only recently have council and synod become distinguishable. In the 1960s, Pope Paul VI, following the promptings of the Second Vatican Council, introduced into the Roman Catholic Church biennial synods of bishops whose purpose was to advise the Pope on certain issues. Thus, there emerged a distinction between synods, whose role was merely advisory and consultative, and councils, which have legislative or executive powers, such as Vatican II." So there's the main distinction between synods and councils. Synods are advisory and consultative, while councils have legislative or executive powers and are thus more binding on the church. But that distinction let's now provide our listeners with a brief, very brief historical survey of the church councils leading up to Vatican II. Obviously, we'll have to be very brief because we're talking about 2,000 years of history. But and one very helpful thing to keep in mind when discussing church councils, and Leo just alluded to this a bit, is that with the exception of Vatican II, virtually every council was the church's response to some sort of threat to the church. And so the council was indeed the church's response to that threat. And two quick examples that might be familiar to our listeners. The first council recognized by the Catholic Church was the First Nicene Council, which was held in 325, which was a response to Arianism. And Arianism concerned the divinity of the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. And so the council was a response to that doctrinal threat. And the Nicene Creed, I think, for example, was in part an answer to that. Second example is the Council of Trent, which met from 1545 to 1563. And of course, that was a response to the threat of the Protestant Reformation. So again, virtually all councils, with the exception of Vatican II, have been the church's response to threats. And that's one reason, which we'll talk about later, that Vatican II is so unique. But back to our brief historical survey of the church councils. According to the Catholic Church historian Norman Tanner, who I mentioned just a moment ago, the councils of the church can be divided into three periods. The first period includes the so-called ecumenical councils, of which there were 7. And the first was the First Nicene Council, held in 325, we just mentioned. And the last was the Second Nicene Council, held in 787. But in between, you have Constantinople I, Ephesus, Chalcedon, Constantinople II, and Constantinople III. So those are the ecumenical councils. And then you have the medieval councils. So this would be the second period. The medieval councils, which spanned from 1123 to 1517, and also included the 5 Lateran councils, which were all held here, right here in Rome. But it's important to note that more than 3 centuries elapsed between the last ecumenical council and the first medieval council. And it's also extremely important to note that the medieval councils took place after the Great Schism in the church, which of course resulted in the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And the Great Schism began in 1054, And as we know today, the separation was never reconciled. So now you have the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church, therefore, does not recognize the medieval councils, but only the ecumenical councils. But we, however, are discussing the councils recognized by the Roman Catholic Church, but it's important to make that distinction. So whereas the 7 ecumenical councils from Nicaea I to Nicaea II were held within the Eastern Church, all of the medieval councils from Lateran I to Lateran V were held in Western churches. So 5 were here in Rome, 2 were in Lyon, France, 1 in Vienne, France, 1 in Constance, Germany, and 1 split between Basel, Switzerland, and Florence, Italy. And so those are the medieval councils. And then you have the third period, which are the councils of the modern era, which are, of course, only recognized by the Catholic Church. And these are the Council of Trent, which was a response to the Protestant Reformation, Vatican I, which was held from 1869 to 1870, and was a response to contemporary issues of the time produced by the Enlightenment and by challenges to long-held traditional beliefs on religion and reason and all of that, and which produced also the dogma of papal infallibility. And then there was Vatican II, which was held from 1962 to 1965, and is arguably the most important and significant church council of them all. So that is a very brief historical survey of the councils, but hopefully it will provide some helpful context for the rest of our discussion on the importance of Vatican II. But first, even before we get to that, there is one question that comes to mind as we review the church councils. And there has emerged some clarity concerning which councils are recognized by the Catholic Church but are not recognized by the Eastern Orthodox Church. But for our purposes, I think it's important to address how evangelicals and Protestants should view the councils. A fact too often overlooked by evangelicals, much to the detriment of the evangelical church, is the fact that ours too is a historical faith, making claim to many of the councils of the church and other important church meetings. But the question is this: how should evangelicals approach and understand the councils, and what role do they play in the history of the evangelical church? And what about the Jerusalem Council, for example, in Acts 15, that's not officially recognized by the Catholic Church as a council? What role does it have? But again, just how do we as evangelicals view and understand the councils and how they have impacted the history of our faith?
Well, the Jerusalem Council was, of course, fundamental in highlighting the nature of the church as the people of God made of Jews and non-Jews, without the non-Jews having to go through the circumcision process. And so opening up the global nature of the church. And evangelicals have recognized the importance of church councils insofar as these councils reflect biblical teaching and defend biblical truth. Many of these councils, especially the medieval ones and the modern councils, Council of Trent and Vatican I and Vatican II, have significantly departed from biblical truth and therefore cannot be recognized as legitimate church councils in the evangelical sense of the word. But evangelicals also recognize the importance of historical gatherings like, for instance, during the post-Reformation times, the Westminster Assembly that produced the Westminster Confession of Faith, or in more recent times in our generation or previous generation or so, the Lausanne Congress of World Evangelization, resulting in the Lausanne Covenant. And so these are church gatherings that are important meetings of the global church, producing important documents. They don't produce inherent, infallible teaching, but they are helpful reference points for our faith and our churches. And so we don't have the same degree of recognition that the Catholic Church has for its own councils, but we do have the evangelical faith is also a global faith and an historical faith. So we do recognize that throughout history there have been significant gatherings of leaders and church pastors and theologians who have helped the church to navigate through the problems of the church itself.
So some of these meetings, such as the Lausanne meetings that came from that, are a way of basically the evangelical church preserving the faith that has been passed down in generations. But as you said, just not in the same type of there's no infallibility coming out of them, but a way just for the evangelical church.
And they also show the fact that the evangelical faith is a Catholic faith in the sense that it is universal. It is not regional. It is not only interested in present-day issues, but it is anchored in the ongoing flow of the history of the people of God.
Yeah, pastors, if you're listening and you think about your own church and say, this is a weak point in my congregation, we would encourage you to do something that we do within our churches here, and that's share those documents. Use them in your profession together as a church on Sunday mornings, and distribute those. Talk about those with your people so that they can heighten their awareness to this global historic faith that we are privileged to be a part of.
And we definitely hope to delve into this conversation. And Clay has done some research on this, but the reason that's important is because a lot of the instances in which you see evangelicals, for example, converting to Roman Catholicism is one of the common themes is the history of the church. And the evangelical church has not done a good job of underscoring and highlighting and celebrating the history of the faith. It's as if it just kind of came out of nowhere and has a very short history and an unclear, undefined history, but that is not the case at all. And so it is important, these types of documents, where of course they do not hold the weight of Scripture, but they do reflect biblical truths and they do show the historicity of the faith. And so those are important to, as Clay said, as good ways for us to, in a church liturgy, for example, underscoring the historicity of the faith. So even going back to the kind of stick on this question for 1 minute, the creeds that came out of the early councils, those are part of our history. Is that correct?
Yeah. that is exactly so. That was the way in which even the reformers looked at them as important statements of the church reflecting on the faith that was taught in Scripture. So ways to convey the main message of the Bible and ways to help the church to be sure or assured of the truthfulness of Christian doctrine. And councils is often, or church gatherings have often played this role of highlighting the importance of confessing together, of defending together, and professing together the gospel.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's spend the rest of our time focusing on why Vatican II is so important and why it is essential to understanding present-day Roman Catholicism. Obviously, we don't have the time right now to enter into a thorough discussion of the theology of Vatican II, but what happened exactly at Vatican II? Why is it arguably the most significant of all the councils, the church councils, and why is it essential, as we have said in the title of this, and we've underscored that a couple of times, why is it essential to understanding present-day Roman Catholic theology?
Well, you just mentioned the fact that it is the latest council held by the Catholic Church, and the latest council has offers the interpretative key to reassess previous councils. So it's a kind of a prism or lenses through which the preceding history is read through. So it is the point of view that helps us to see how the Catholic Church reflects and teaches its own identity and teachings and practices. The latest is the window through which the Catholic Church sees its history. So it is important that we understand what happened then, in order to evaluate where the Catholic Church stands in the present day. It is not correct to say that the Catholic Church, going back to previous councils, it sticks to them in the same way in which the Church sticks to the latest council, because the latest is the entry point to the previous ones. And so it's important to understand what happened at the latest council in order to understand the trajectory and the development and the ongoing flow of Catholic tradition and theology and spirituality.
That raises a question for me. You talk about the development in understanding the previous councils leading up to the most recent. So that's to say that they don't contradict each other.
Well,
they're not allowed to.
Yeah, they're not allowed to. They of course they contradict each other. Of course they say different things. Of course they actually use not only different languages, but they actually teach different things. One obvious example is religious freedom. For centuries, the Catholic Church has opposed religious freedom, and yet Vatican II says the Church approves religious freedom. This is a contradiction. This is a change of mind of the Catholic Church. But in terms of the internal mindset of the Catholic Church, there's always a sense of things unfolding, things developing, never contradicting. Or another example, the way in which non-Catholic Christians are referred to. In previous modern councils, Trent, Vatican I, they are called heretics, they're called enemies of the faith, and yet Vatican II speaks of them as separated brethren. Now, is this a development or is this a change of mind? Because we're talking about two very different things, and yet Vatican II is understood as developing the tradition rather than changing it or saying contradictory things. Of course, from the outside, when we see these things happening, we see the contradiction. But in terms of the internal frame of reference of the Catholic Church, these are ongoing instances of the ongoing development of the same one Catholic tradition.
So the Pope, there was an interim Pope, correct? That was that opened Vatican II. Is that correct? John the 23rd.
Yes.
And then with Pope Paul VI, becoming Pope.
He concluded
So when Pope John the 23rd, the interim Pope, opened it, he spoke of the key word that was used for this council was aggiornamento, which of course is the Italian word for updating. So it was basically an updating of the church and its theology to the modern times. And we mentioned previously that church councils historically are responses to threats, and they issue anathemas, they issue curses. This council did not do that. And so what exactly was this? Tell us about the times in which, we're talking about 1962 to 65, what was this aggiornamento? What was the church doing here?
It was after Second World War, in the middle of the 20th century, and the Catholic Church in the previous decades and centuries had developed a very antagonistic attitude towards everything that was not part of it. So the modern world, modern culture, human rights, other non-Catholic Christians, world religions, and science, social movements, and everything was an enemy. It was considered to be an enemy, an adversary to be fought against. And the Vatican II and John the 23rd understood that this attitude was basically leading the church to become a kind of a angry little religious group and losing the Catholicity, the ability of the church to be the global world embracing, affirming church that the Catholic Church claims to be. So it was an attempt to readdress the balance between the Roman and the Catholic dimensions of the Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Church, on the one hand, Roman, so very attached to Roman dogma, Roman canon law, Roman hierarchy, Roman structures, Roman discipline, Roman politics, Roman power, Roman papal power. On the other, the Catholic dimension of the Catholic Church, universal, affirming, friendly, absorbing, endorsing, etc. So for many centuries, the focus of the Roman Catholic Church had been on the Roman side of its own identity. So the anathemas were all expressions of saying, if you're not with us, you are against us. If you don't endorse what we say, you are cursed. That was an affirmation of the Roman side of the Roman Catholic Church. But John the 23rd understood that in the modern time, the time had come to reassess or rebalance the tension between the two. And so Vatican II wanted to play the Catholic pedal and abstain from using the Roman pedal in order to readdress the balance. And so that explains the reason why there is no curse, there is no condemnation. Everything, the tone of the council is very friendly, is very accommodating, is very positive, very optimistic, and wanting to affirm the modern world, wanting to endorse it, wanting to embrace it, wanting to find common ground with the modern world. So with also non-Catholic Christians, with world religions, with the people of goodwill, with social movements, with science, with whatever in modern society. So it was an important readdressing of that balance that resulted in a Catholic Church having a different face, friendly, affirming, embracing, rather than being angry, antagonistic, and fighting against others.
Which sounds nice. And in several of your conferences where you've provided an evangelical assessment of Pope Francis, you describe him as being probably the first pope since Vatican II to fully embody Vatican II theology. And we see that in the way that he engages with the world and religious leaders from even non-Judeo-Christian religious backgrounds. So,
for the first time, Vatican II didn't issue any doctrine or dogma, didn't want to address doctrinal issues. Of course, there are some documents more doctrinal than others, but it wanted to have a pastoral tone, wanted to have a friendly tone, and resulting in no one being expelled, no one being excluded, but all being included, all being welcomed.
Which we see now within Roman Catholicism is even creating some internal conflict and crisis, with Pope Francis not taking firm stands on certain situations where there appears to be openness that seems to be contrary to official church teaching.
Yeah, that's right. This is the long-term result of majoring on the Catholicity of the church over against the Roman aspects of the church. So if you follow the line of Catholicity, you end up in Pope Francis. Everyone is included. Everyone is a brother and sister. Everyone is part of this sacramental church. Muslims are brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. It's the result of this insistence on the Catholicity, and people are becoming aware that the Catholic Church needs to readdress. It's time to readdress the balance again, to go back to some Roman elements in order to not to go too far into the other extreme.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that this is not limited or unique to the Catholic Church by any means, but when we often try to address a misbalance or correct a misbalance. We go from one extreme to the other. And so with Vatican II, there was the extreme of the Roman side of things, especially, I mean, you think about Vatican II, before that you only had a short council with Vatican I that was never actually completed.
Yeah.
And then before that was all the way back to the 16th century.
Yeah.
So the Council of Trent is as Roman as you get.
Oh, yeah.
Vatican II is as Catholic as you get.
That's right.
So, and we'll see that. In fact, when we're talking about why is this council so important and essential to understanding Roman Catholicism, as Leo said it well, the answer is, in short, it's the latest council, and therefore it's the lens through which all other councils are interpreted. Even though it often, from a logical sense, contradicts prior councils, it's not a nullifying of those councils, but a development. In fact, what we want to do actually next week, we'll be back before taking our Christmas break, but we want to dive in a little bit into this theology of Vatican II that is so apparently contradictory. In 1973, there was an evangelical theologian named David Wells who was examining the documents of Vatican II, and he wrote a book called Revolution in Rome. It's a great book if you want a resource on an evangelical looking at Vatican II. And John Stott wrote a foreword to it, and I just want to read a quick quote from John Stott. He says, "The Roman," and speaking of Vatican II, this is so less than 10 years after the closure of Vatican II. He says, "The Roman monolith, which for centuries has appeared inviolable, has at last cracked open. Conservatives and progressives, traditionalists and radicals are engaged in a fierce power struggle. Because the issues were still open during Vatican II, the Council endorsed opinions which oppose, contradict, and exclude each other. To many observers, the whole church seems to be in unprecedented disarray." Now, that was in 1973 that Stott wrote that. The amazing thing is that for 50 years, the church has been able to maintain somehow those contradictions, and it continues to move forward. But how do we read those contradictions, and how do we make sense of them? That will be the topic of our next week's discussion, looking into some key documents of Vatican II that put that on full display. So do not miss that. But other than this resource, I referenced Norman P. Tanner. He's a Catholic church historian. It's a very small book called "The Councils of the Church: A Short History." If you want to learn more about that. One thing, this wasn't the main focus of our discussion today, but it is important, this idea of evangelicals understanding the historicity of our faith. And there's a great professor of theological studies at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. His name is Kenneth Stewart, and he wrote a book called "In Search of Ancient Roots: The Christian Past and the Evangelical Identity Crisis." Yep. That's a great resource for evangelicals to look at, especially leaders and pastors who are need to underscore the importance of the historicity of our faith. Yep. Any other resources come to mind directly, or?
Yes, VaticanFiles.org.
Yes.
And you're welcome, man. The Reformand Initiative website. Specifically, if you go to the VaticanFiles.org website and go to resources and look at previous articles, you're going to see Vatican II in many of the titles. So you're going to see a lot of valuable work that Leonardo has poured into understanding and analyzing Vatican II and post-Vatican II theology and practice on our website. And when we talk about creed specifically, there's a really interesting article Leo released on April 1st of this year, and it's Vatican File 160, "Is the Nicene Faith the Basis for Ecumenism?" It's a really interesting article. We got a lot of good feedback, actually, from well-known professors and scholars who are evangelicals and interact with Roman Catholics as a result of that article. So, yes, VaticanFiles.org. And then if you want to visit our website, reformandinitiative.org, we've got resources there as well. You'll find book reviews, you'll find audio resources, video resources. So you'll also find a form if you have any questions about those resources. Send us an email. We'll be happy to respond to you. Also, you can follow us on social media, on Twitter at Reformanda Rome, and on Facebook at Reformanda Initiative. Follow us, share our post, retweet our tweets, tell your friends about our podcast. We would greatly appreciate it, and we're super thankful to all of our listeners that have done that so far. We've been really happy and pleased by your support for us, so keep that up.
We have 20 people signed up for Rome Scholars and Leaders Network next year.
Yeah,
so
we have 22.
Get online and come
actually.
sign up. Oh, 22.
22. And
Come visit us in Rome next summer.
Yeah, for a full week of diving deep and understanding Roman Catholic theology and practice so that you can be better equipped as a scholar and a leader within the evangelical world to better understand Roman Catholicism and help people who are serving in those contexts preserve and promote the gospel to Roman Catholics. So that's going to be June 15th through the 19th. Register, and if you want to take advantage of the early bird price and save some money, you need to register, be approved, and have your payments submitted by the end of December. So we welcome you to do that. It's going to be a great week. We've got participants who are coming back for their 5th year in a row. So, I mean, it's not only a great time of formation, but it's a great time of establishing community as well. So that's it for today. As always, if you have any questions, send us a message. We'll be happy to reply. And for now, we would say from Rome, God bless.